Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray bunker. These aren't film reviews as such that I do here. I almost entirely just talk about the film's 3D and how well I think it works. And this time I'm looking at 2014's Edge of Tomorrow, which has an aspect ratio of 2.39 to 1 and it was post-converted into 3D. Also, I think relatively unusually for a post-converted film, this one was shot on film, which as far as I'm concerned helps to make it look as good as it does. Tom Cruise has been in, I think, 4 3D films to date, none of them shot natively, and whilst the 3D re-release of Top Gun predated this, Edge of Tomorrow can be counted as the first of his films to have been made for a 3D release. So before things start exploding, I think there's a really interesting thing going on straight off, and that's the excellent way close-ups show the actors' faces in very clear 3D. This is light years ahead of some of those early conversions where faces look little better than a sort of vague head shape with a face painted on it. So this reveals precisely how the actors really look. And when it's someone like Tom Cruise, who by this time audiences had been familiar with for over 30 years, it's quite striking how different he looks in this more realistic view. That Cruise nose does seem a little bit more prominent in 3D, and you really do feel that you're getting a more accurate understanding of bone structure, and I've read that the actors' faces were scanned to create accurate depth models, which I think is pretty much standard practice these days, but it's not always done as well as it is here. And thankfully, it's not just close-up faces that make for impressive 3D, because overall this is a great conversion by prime focus, with basically everything looking like it was done about as well as it could have been. Right at the start, the film puts together a montage of news clips, some of it stock footage and some of it shot for the film, some in 1.85 to 1, some in 2.39 to 1. It's that clever mix-up of real and fictional news footage that I think Oliver Stone's JFK had taken to a new art form a quarter of a century earlier, and they do that standard thing of using real newsreaders, like it's good to see Jane Hill there, who's one of the BBC's most prominent newsreaders, and giving a surprisingly good performance, I thought. But also, there's what I think is something quite clever, and that's having bits of this montage flick in and out of 3D. It's literally just a few frames here and there to create an almost subliminal feeling of this being real. Although, on the subject of clever uses of 3D, there's one shot that I really think does a very smart job of setting something up, and that's this view of Cruise waking up on top of some bags. There's not a great deal of actual depth in the setup here, maybe 2 feet or something like that, but the 3D feels very strong and more noticeable than it might be expected to. And the reason I think that's pretty clever is because this is a moment in the film that becomes a very significant point. So seeing it in strong 3D here helps to give it a sense of presence and importance. It's maybe subtle, but I think it's very effective. So this is a film about war, humans versus alien invaders, so you can expect a lot of weaponry. That being the case, it's possibly slightly surprising that we don't see a lot more guns poking out of the screen. There are a few, not a classic example of it here, being quite out of focus, which might suggest that this was in many ways shot as a 2D film. It's better here, but still nothing like the best gun out of the screen shot you've ever seen. They do include a pop-out gun shot that I don't recall having seen before, and that's the wires flying out of this taser gun and out of the screen, so that made for something new and fun. It's not a film that pushes hyper-stereo shots, although this view of London looks slightly wider than the natural view, which I regard as a good thing. I'm not sure it really needed to say London there, though. I mean, I know this is my home country, but everyone knows that view, don't they? Actually, something interesting in this still is that it's very possible you didn't immediately notice the helicopter in it, and maybe even now you'll struggle to spot it straight away. If you saw this in motion, you'd obviously see it right away, but if you were looking at this still in 3D, you'd also see the helicopter immediately, and that's just another one of the reasons that I love stereoscopy so much. We get another view of the Thames later on in the film, and it's one of those really nice low-level shots where the plane of the surface stretches back into the screen to what I want to say is Waterloo Bridge, but I don't live there, so I don't really know. And back on that helicopter, I think they often look great in 3D films, sort of hanging in space the way they do. Jurassic Park, for example, springs to mind here, and again, this looks to me like a sign of them having been maybe primarily making a 2D film. The helicopter's just breaking the frame too much to be as impressive as it could be. So that first view of London London was ever so slightly hyperstereo, and these shots of various flying machines are shown at about the same level of strength, so a tiny bit of discernible 3D in these long shots, a bit more than you get in reality, but nothing dramatic. And this last view is really good though, as it suddenly has a foreground thing appearing, looking like it's flown directly beneath us. There are great views inside those dropships. The lines of troops look excellent, and I think one of the reasons it looks so good here is because it's not just columns of people, which by itself is a view that looks good in 3D anyway, but because they're wearing those mech suits, so it gives a solid and uniform structure to the view, which makes the 3D stand out just that bit more. And I believe that those mech battle suits were all actually practical rather than CG, which definitely helps you to feel their weight, and the 3D heaps on an extra feeling of its realism. And I mentioned that it looked to me like there were a few clues here and there that this was predominantly shot as a 2D film, and the thing that suggests that to me most of all is Doug Liman's persistent use of shaky cam. And I don't know if this is handheld or loose gimbal or whatever, but to my eyes it's just overdone a little bit. I get how it's used during the battle scenes to make it feel more like you're there, but he also uses it during conversational scenes. It's far from the shakiest film I've seen, but I never think that style is beneficial to 3D. Also, something that often goes hand in hand with shaky cam is fast cutting, and there's quite a bit of that too. So whilst this has been wrangled into excellent 3D, for my money it's those two elements that prevent it from being top flight 3D demo material. But don't get me wrong, the 3D is very good and quite bold throughout the film. The aliens themselves, which feel to me like a very good original design, look like they've been rendered in native 3D CG, as they look fantastically solid. And the holograms were definitely rendered in 3D, which is why they look so good here, better than most, if not all, of the holograms in the 3D Star Wars films, for example. There's a great moment where one of those aliens flicks his arms or legs or tentacles or whatever they are at the camera and out of the screen, and he does it 2 or 3 times in a row. It's almost like it's a jokey alien homage to the House of Wax paddleball shot. It does happen extremely quickly though, and that is the case for most of the more overt pop-out 3D moments in the film, lots of which is particles of one sort or another, and with its battle scenes there's all sorts of stuff being flung around in 3D space as a result of explosions and gun blasts or huge things crashing into the ground. Glass smashes and shatters and flies towards us, presumably digitally, and all of this looks really good, even if it does happen extremely quickly. Same kind of thing with a nice but very brief crash through a brick wall and all of the bricks being thrown towards the camera. And just by way of agreeing with myself, I think by far the best particle moment is an exploding alien, which happens in slow motion, so this shot really looks superb. There are underwater bubbles nicely spread across the Z-axis, and there's a really lovely shot where the camera passes through a curtain of water. It's a nice move and very effective in 3D. There's a training sequence where metal simulations of the aliens have been rigged up to zoom around the room, both towards and away from the camera, across the screen, every which way, although they moved very fast, and again, I think that maybe this was all cut together a bit too quickly to make for classic 3D. Outside of all the film's mayhem, there are plenty more very good 3D shots, like seeing people behind vehicle screens always gives a strong sense of space, and it definitely helps when a windscreen is filthy, and this one's maybe a bit more unusual, where the helicopter screen is wet and kind of hazy as well, and I love the way that a quite diffused Emily Blunt is in a very different 3D space beyond it. Maybe the smallest and potentially most inconsequential shot in the film is this one. It's very banal, a car's dashboard, but it's excellent the way the dust and smudges on the screen sit clearly above the display, and it's a view that most of us are so used to, and seeing it on film exactly how it looks in reality is one of those tiny little details that helps massively with the atmosphere of the shot. I mentioned a few things that I thought made it look like they weren't especially considering a 3D conversion, but just to contradict that, there are loads of examples of production design where it looks very much like perhaps they were thinking about how it would look in 3D, and all of these views look extremely solid and deep. They're full of detail, lots of stuff sitting in 3D space at various different points, foreground, middle ground and background. You can really feel the ambience in this place here, or I love the view of the barracks where the 3D gives a much stronger feeling of all of these people living on top of each other than I think can be conveyed in 2D. And of course, because this is primarily an action film with a lot of great battle scenes, that seems like the right place to end this, in the thick of the fight. In spite of the shaky cam, the 3D is solid and strong with a lot going on in 3D space. There are lots of cool smoke trails, sometimes seen from above at various different heights in 3D space, or sometimes firing away from us and into the screen. It's all very good, very powerful 3D. So, just a very quick word about the film itself. I don't normally really talk about the film's stories because, to me, that always represents a spoiler at some level, so I'm going to try not to do it here either. But if you haven't seen the film and know nothing about it, my advice is to watch it without reading anything at all about it. I do find it a bit disappointing that the film's own marketing, along with every review, will tell you the basic premise of the film, which is something that doesn't become apparent until about 25 minutes into it, which is a good 20% of the running time. I completely understand that that's the heart of the movie, so that's how it had to be sold, but what a treat it would be to watch this not being aware of that story point. So I prefer to describe this more vaguely as a film about a war against aliens with a time twist to it, or something like that, but every single review ever will mention another specific film to which this one has a key similarity, and given that the film covers the subject of repetition, I do find it quite funny that they've got through 3 different titles for it, from All You Need Is Kill to Edge of Tomorrow to Live, Die, Repeat. So pick your favourite and call it that. For me, Edge of Tomorrow just edges it. Anyway, apart from the film that everyone mentions, there's also a dose of Starship Troopers, Saving Private Ryan, Aliens, and a bunch of others, so it does feel like a mashup of various other films, but ultimately it manages to be not just its own thing, but a surprisingly excellent and very entertaining thing. This is a bit of a gem of a standalone film, and it's unusual for Cruise in that he has a big character arc that plays out really well, so the Tom at the start is not the action Tom that we might expect, and maybe unexpectedly, it's also a very funny film in places, with lots of the humour being used in the same way as it is in that other film, which, as much as I love it, I'm just not going to mention it on a matter of principle. All I'll say is that it's a shame that Edge of Tomorrow wasn't set on February the 2nd, although appropriately it is set in the year that I'm recording this. So it's funny, fun, full of very good action, it's a good story, and it even manages to make some sense out of its basically daft high-concept premise. Good performances all round, including an enjoyable turn from the much-loved and much-missed Bill Paxton. Couple all of that with a really strong 3D presentation, and I'd say this is a fairly essential addition to anyone's 3D collection. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.